Allison, welcome to the Z Marketing Podcast. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, first thing I always like to ask my guests, and I apologize to my listeners if my audio quality is not as good today. I'm on a different office, don't have the usual mic, but I'd love to ask you, what is your elevator pitch or your 30-second commercial of who you are and what you do? In essence, who is Allison Kade?
Well, that sounds much deeper metaphysically, but I will answer the question on who I am professionally for the sake of this podcast. So I run a boutique content marketing agency called Contented. Haha, get it? And we really span the gamut. Primarily, our biggest core area is in personal finance. We work with a lot of fintech startups, also have a fair bit of exposure to healthcare and the climate space. And we do everything from content strategy and really being this fully outsourced team for startups that don't have their own content operation to doing ad hoc articles for those who do. In some cases, we've even done mentorship. So I had this really wonderful client where a new CEO who was my contact came in and inherited a content person who had some innate capabilities, but had never really had an editor to teach her a lot of content best practices. So I had a lot of respect for the fact that rather than replacing that person or hiring someone severely ahead of that person, they brought us in. So it was me and one of my most trusted editors, and we mentored that person. We really, I think that this person would agree, elevated the quality of the content. We were with her as she was interviewing her first source to quote in an article and walking through it, and really did a lot of teaching. And so she was able to get a promotion and really level up her skills that she can take with her. But from the company's perspective, although I don't know for sure, I strongly imagine that the combined cost was less than that of a senior chief content officer. And it was this really excellent engagement. So really spanning the gamut in the content world.
That's excellent. And I love the name Contented. There's a few different blogs or sites, or even in my own writing, I love to play on the words content and content. There's a lot there. And it sounds like you do a lot of long form. And would you even call some of what you do brand journalism, or is that a different
I
thing?
would. I think that is fair. I mean, I think that a lot of, to your point, a lot of what we're doing is in many cases indistinguishable from actual journalism, except that the home that it lives on is a brand's page. And in some cases, we do literal journalism. We've written articles for Think Advisor, which is a publication for financial advisors. So we can really span the gamut. But most of the people that I work with are journalists and former journalists.
Excellent. So that you're getting actual, quality questions, getting deeper into the material, people who know how to, really interview and get the facts and get the things that are most of interest or most newsworthy to the client or to the audience. And that's really, really important. So my background is also in content writing. And I'd be curious to know also from you, like how you got into, actually, let's start with that. How did you get into content marketing?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you'd asked me in second grade what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have said a writer. Admittedly, I was envisioning more novels than online content about personal finance. But that really carried throughout all of my time in school. And I ended up graduating college right at the dawn of the Great Recession in 2008. I had kind of a random first job, but I was working at an alternative asset management recruiting firm doing kind of generic stuff. And my first day of work was the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed. And literally the first assignment they ever gave me was try random extensions at Lehman Brothers. Whoever picks up the phone, get their resume, hang up, keep trying until the lines go dead. And that was the first assignment of my working career.
Wow.
So it was this incredible backdrop of like a front row seat. I mean, and all of my friends were these brand new junior investment bankers being laid off, and they were coming through our office. I mean, it was this front row seat in New York to the cataclysm unfolding around me. And so that's really in many ways the genesis of my interest in finance. Specifically, so I was doing this job, I was moonlighting on the side as an editor of this environmental news publication. And, I always knew that I liked writing. And then I was able to synthesize those two things. I don't know if you're familiar with LearnVest, but it was a fintech startup that back in, 2009 was, Buzzy in its heyday. It was later acquired by Northwestern Mutual in, I think, 2015 or something. And so I was one of the early employees there. And so I was on the founding editorial team, really building out this voicey, very personal finance brand that was sort of styling its, do you remember Daily Candy? It was styling itself as sort of the Daily Candy of personal finances.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Maybe I'm older than you. I might be dating that. I don't know.
No, I graduated only a couple years after you.
Yeah. So anyway, it was this really transformative experience. I ended up becoming deputy editor to an editorial team of like 8 people, and managing editors and staff writers, and really seeing the full editorial operation. And in many ways, that's where I gained my stripes. Following that, I freelanced for several years, which was always this goal. And I was scared to know if I could really do it and strike out on my own. And I was really proud to say I could. I ended up going back in-house when I moved to Morgan Stanley, because my client actually recruited me over, which was really lovely. And so I was there for a period of time. And after that, I ended up going to like a fintech, insurtech startup called Fabric, which is creating personal finance products for young families. So primarily term life insurance. They have like UGMAs, college savings, stuff like that. And so I worked for them for several years, had this content agency as sort of a side business, which was a holdover from my time freelancing, that people would come to me through referrals and such. And I was in the fortunate position that in 2021, I was able to leave and do that full time. I'm also very pleased to say that, Fabric is still a client, and I'm still working with them all these years later, which is really wonderful as well. So it's really been this kind of journey. But if the recession hadn't happened, if I hadn't wound up in New York, if that wasn't my first job, I don't know, roll the dice. Probably I'd be
a lot of interesting things I'd love to dig in on that are not even, of course, in the pre-prepped questions, but
Sure.
a couple things like I was in school during that recession. I graduated a couple years after, and I remember several friends of mine, including one that's been on this podcast, who started a successful tech PR firm that he ultimately sold. A lot of them, it wasn't in the plans to start a business or do what they did, but after their job fell through or whatever was lined up, like they had to pivot. And I know a lot of people with great stories that were born from the challenges of the financial recession in 2008 or the COVID pandemic 2020.
That's
so
true.
sometimes, necessity is the mother of invention, they say, and adversity could breed innovation. I'm always interested in that. And like you, like many people who find themselves in content marketing, I also was like a writer. I wrote manuscripts, kids' books, different things. I was thinking about going into journalism at one point. I was also blogging for a local DC site before I even knew I wanted to get into marketing. And that's translated to doing a lot of blogging and advertorials, where I think like you, thrived and really enjoy it, but I never would have. It wasn't like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a content marketer, right? But and ultimately when I launched my agency in 2018, ZEV Media, we began as a content marketing shop, but ultimately we migrated more into paid media advertising. And though we do both, but interestingly, and I don't know if this has been your experience, but I often see content marketing and advertising pitted against each other, almost like adversaries, as if it's some sort of either or kind of thing. Personally, I think that's an unfortunate mistake, especially now when social media algorithms provide very little organic reach, and search engine algorithms have become increasingly pay to play, making it harder for quality content from businesses to rise to the top. And I think stellar content doesn't always get nearly the exposure and engagement that it deserves. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how can content marketing and advertising work together?
Yeah, I think the job experience that comes to mind is when I was at Fabric, I had a really wonderful counterpart who, so if I was essentially the head of organic marketing, this person was the head of performance marketing. And it was really wonderful to not feel like we were at loggerheads and we were partners who could work together. And I think that can look in different ways. So for example, even at that company, you're trying to sell term life insurance policies. That is a big decision a product that people might hold on to for 20, 30, like for whatever the term of their insurance policy is. And it has a very long consideration cycle. So counterintuitively, even though one of the gospels of marketing is, shorten the funnel, make it fast, we found that lengthening the funnel in some ways gave people the time to breathe and think and create a little bit more affinity, and actually led to conversions. And so I think that in some cases, we were directing paid ad dollars towards articles because people don't always know why they need term life insurance. Maybe they're skeptical, and so being able to do those things in concert, I think, can potentially be really powerful. I also think that a terrible pitfall that I don't have a perfect answer for is the question of attribution and in content, because performance marketing is so much more attributable. So I think it's really tempting to say, look at this Facebook ad. I can prove to you how many sales I've made. And maybe with content on something that is not as dense and long consideration as life insurance, lipstick, you could probably attribute, right? They read an article, they like your lipstick, they buy it. But something that has these long consideration cycles and big user journeys are often so challenging. I mean, first of all, on the technical side, right? Like even if you're using, your UTM codes, are we going to use first touch attribution? Or are we going to use last touch attribution? Is it something in the middle? How do you build that? And then what if they came in from an ad, but then they read your content, but then they were retargeted by an ad? Does the ad get the glory? It's so, and I think that to your point, when you have this adversarial outlook, there's this temptation to say, oh, well, the ad owns that. You don't deserve that. Versus saying, maybe these two things helped each other and made the sale together. And I think that can be really challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I could go really way longer than we have on this podcast into this topic. I think it's so important. And I think a lot of businesses, especially smaller businesses that aren't as marketing focused or non-marketers, they often think about literally last attribution only. And that's a huge miss because a lot of the sales made first touch and from other brand touch points. And to only focus on last touch, you're going to be a lot more ineffective because you're ignoring a large part of the market, the much larger part that needs to build trust and get to know you, what you offer, and like your value. And I think that's I do think one hand washes the other, and what you outlined there is a perfect synthesis of how content marketing and advertising work in 2024 going into 2025 at the recording of this podcast. So I want to also ask you, there's a debates between content marketing versus paid ads, organic and paid, long form and short form. I think what you were just summing up there is the importance of context. A lot of it's very context dependent, when and how you use each of these things. But I think a lot of people, when they're looking at content marketing, some people look at it more from a branding point of view, more of a positioning, a brand message. Others look at it very narrow in terms of just SEO. Like we need content that keywords and get us on the first page of Google. And I think there's a lot of debate there. So in your opinion, how can content marketing, I know we just were talking about attribution, how challenging that could be, but what are some ways that you think that you can tie content marketing efforts back to business objectives and outcomes or bottom line?
In an ideal world, content does both brand and SEO and achieves multiple things at once. I also think that the goal that you're seeking has to be situationally dependent. You have a company, you're in a space that's well established with known keywords that are winnable, and you have no audience. Obviously, you have to go build content and try to get those keywords, right? Versus you are in a space that you are such an innovator that the keywords basically don't exist and you're creating a whole new market and people need to know about you and you should be doing thought leadership and no one's heard of you, but you have a following because you're kind of an influencer. Well, okay, SEO is not going to get you as much. There's no search volume. And yet you have some people who are reading you. It's always a question of distribution. But for those people, then maybe it's a question of branding and positioning. I mean, I will say that as someone who has touched both sides, maybe I shouldn't show my hand this way to any potential clients watching or listening to this, but I do find the brand side so much more satisfying because you can, that's where a lot of the voice and innovation and uniqueness lies. Whereas doing SEO content is often necessary. And I think that the way to do it is to do it in such a way that it adheres to your brand principles and it's within your brand voice and it can be high quality. Nonetheless, an article about what is life insurance is an article about what is life insurance. Like there's sort of a limit to how zany you can get when everyone is literally looking at the SERPs and copying each other and stuffing it into their own articles. Like there's kind of a limit. Whereas, you know, so back in the early days of LearnVest, its big main vehicle and driver was this daily newsletter, which is pretty beautiful because there's no SEO really in a newsletter. I mean, it linked back to blog posts, but you're not going to send people a daily newsletter with a boring article about what is life insurance. It was these really timely pieces that people really looked for in their inboxes and really read every day. And that's just so powerful and built this brand that was incredibly voicey and very, very, very specific. And I think that's really powerful. I think that it's much harder to do that today than it was in 2009.
Yeah.
I think things are a lot more pay to play. I think it's a lot more crowded out there. I mean, half of that brand was built on syndication partnerships that, you know, in 2011, Huffington Post thought we were doing it a favor by giving it free content to reprint.
I used to be
right?
one of those suckers writing for their blog. Yeah.
Right. No, well, we wouldn't write for them. We would do our own content and they would just republish it. You know, Business Insider would just syndicate our stuff. We had, you know, Fox Business News. We had like people would just take our content and we're like, well, we're magnanimously allowing you to reprint it. And it was great, you know, and that doesn't exist anymore. So I think the playbook has changed and become a lot more difficult, but one could argue that we're kind of living in a new renaissance of newsletters in a Substack age, you know, and I think there's said for owning an audience where you can just write about interesting stuff as opposed to pandering to a search engine audience where the only things you can write about and get eyeballs on are like 101 level explainers. And I do think
10 ways to do this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, actually not 10, 9, because odd numbers always do better 7. Than even. Yeah,
7. It's always 7. Yeah.
It's always 7, exactly. So true. So funny, I almost said that. Yeah. So I think that you're right. It's changed a lot. And you know, when I was getting into content marketing around 2012, it was a lot, and I did plenty of writing for Insider and Huffington Post. And this was sort of just when the age of blogging was giving way to the age of social. And now we're entering the age of, now we're in the age of AI and Web3. And I think like, it kind of goes back to the very old debate of marketing versus sales. And I think to your point about branding, you know, if you want to pay to acquire each customer, then go ahead. But if you want ultimately to not have to pay, you have people coming to you inbound, not having to pay a dime for new leads or customers, or have better customers who are so like bought in because they're like part of your religion now. They're like, you know, not people you have to convince, not people you have to, you know, always be selling. Then it behooves any company to work on the longer term brand building. Now, of course, a small business needs to be scrappy. They need the revenue, they need to make payroll. I get it. But like, if you really want to ultimately get bigger, I think you need to invest in building the brand and doing things that a lot of companies hate, of branding, giving value, that long-term funnel. One guest who's been on my show, maybe you probably know, he is Jay Bear. He's a great digital marketing guru. He often says that advertising is a price you pay for being uninterested. Now, maybe today I wouldn't go that far. I feel like everyone needs to do some paid mix to get the content seen and things like that. But I definitely think there's truth in that, because you're going to have a lot more success long term, if you think about the long term, by having a compelling brand voice. So with all that, I'd love to segue into the subject of blogging. You know, I personally love blogging and long form writing. As like I said, that was my beginning, was blogging for myself and companies. And I've been actually rethinking, I've been thinking lately about restarting my blog in 2025, despite all those people who say blogging's dead. And of course, the merits of using any tactic largely depend on your goals. But what are your thoughts about blogging? Does a company need a blog today, and what kind of content can help a business? You know, how could a blog help a business?
So it feels like it's maybe sort of denying myself business, but I don't think every company necessarily needs a blog. If you have an amazing, you know, consumer facing product that you make that people like, that is viral, that's on social, like, I don't know that you have to write a million articles about luggage specifications to sell your suitcase. Maybe your suitcase sells without it. You know, I don't think that every company has to become a media company. I think the big issue in my experience that I noticed with brands is that there's no distribution strategy. And so if you tell me that you have no email list, no customers to send this to, you're competing in a space where those SEO keywords are basically unwinnable. Well, what's the plan here? Like, I'm not saying that content would be bad, but who's reading it and how? And I think that without a clear plan, it is kind of a waste of money. And I think that to some extent, maybe it's a question of not yet. Your company needs to grow so that you have a bigger customer base, and maybe you do grow inorganically at first, and then you use content to get that flywheel spinning. Or if you're in a space where you have any earthly shot of winning your SEO keywords, great. But you know, if you're trying to win on, I don't know, what's the hardest keyword? You like, right? You're like trying to beat out Wikipedia and Google and Microsoft on a keyword, and like they're all the top 10, and you're a startup with no domain authority, no built-in audio. Like, what are we doing here? Like, what's the point? Is this an SEO play? Is this a branding play? If it's a branding play, how are you getting those eyeballs? And I think that without a clear plan on that, it could be a waste of money. And I think
I agree with you. I think it's a lot about strategy and distribution now. And I think that's why I've moved a lot more towards that. And even with blogging, even I saw the writing on the wall a few years ago, about 5, 6 years ago, that social is becoming more paid, that blog content, it's not about competing with these big companies. That is not accessible for small businesses or startups.
exactly.
To get #1 on Google and all. Not only that, even the big brands are suffering because Google Gemini, and you know, they're just putting, the AI is just putting their own answers and prioritizing those who pay. So I think that a lot of it is you can use informational content, but having a good newsletter, a good group, if you have a chat,
channels are more
own
important.
channels, that's the future. That's the community. Do you want to speak more on that?
How do you build that newsletter, right? So like, it's nice for me to say, okay, your newsletter is more important. Owned channels, you know what? Screw SEO, I don't even like it. Let's just do really cool stuff in your newsletter, and I'm gonna build you some calculators and infographics and sparkly stuff. Like, I do think that is the future. Like, in an AI world in which AI can churn out super generic SEO content for you, but also your competitors, and also the chat like the chat version of search might block out any actual traffic to your website. I think it's true. I think that there's actually will be a separation between really cheap, almost valueless content and content that is going to look more expensive in contrast, but has that sparkle factor and originality and innovation that ChatGPT isn't going to be able to do. But you need an audience for that. So if you started your company yesterday and have no leads, and I'm telling you, double down on your newsletter, and your newsletter is your parents and your college like, what are we doing here? Like, you need, I think there is still a gap in how are you building these distribution channels? And I hate to say it, but that seems harder than ever.
Oh yeah. There's a balance. Like, you got to some degree play the game. You've got to use these big social platforms and tactics and Google and all of that. But and actually Mark Schaefer, author of Belonging to the Brand, he's going to be making his second appearance on the show soon, and his whole thesis is like the last frontier for marketers now is community and this kind of custom content. And I like that term sparkle factor.
Yeah.
I'd love to use that. And basically,
Credit though. Give me a footnote every time you do it.
Of course I will. Yes, I will give a citation.
Yeah.
I'll say, as the great Allison Kade.
I like that.
But it's really,
and like tell them to hire me, be like, I would like a full advertisement, please, every time.
Yes, a link back, everything, for sure.
Perfect.
A retweet,
Perfect.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it's like maybe we'll come full circle in a way, like I know, like I remember the book like Gary Vee, Thank You Economy, with the age of the internet, saying that people want to do business increasingly with companies they know, like back in the old days. Well, I think now with all the bombardment and AI, like people aren't buying things now unless they're like usually it depends, everyday things, of course, people don't care that much, but increasingly people are joining for these long sales cycles that you mentioned. Yeah. Like a lot of times people get people in these like community things and there's a lot of excitement around it, and then they buy it, you know what I mean? Like they put the offer, they don't have to pay to get those sales, they just have to basically pay to get this community and get these members, and then people really want to get, and I think that's increasingly what's happening. So I'd just love to ask, we mentioned AI. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the uses of AI in content marketing. Do you think it's an opportunity? Do you currently use any AI tools to manage your workflow or the content creation process? And do you have any hesitations or see any potential issues with AI and content creation?
I mean, I'm probably going to sound like a Luddite denier of facts. I think there is value in AI, although frankly, is the value worth the cost of like the environmental cost of all of the energy consumption? Honestly, people are using it to like generate a recipe. I don't know. I'm not convinced. But even setting that aside, I have dabbled, and candidly, so far, I'm sure that things will change within a few years. But at the moment, I'm not finding amazing, maybe you'll tell me how you think I should use it. I'm not finding amazing use cases. So and I think part of it actually is my reluctance to feed the algorithms. And so I think if I embraced that more, I would find a lot more useful use cases. But I don't feel like it's really appropriate for me to be feeding stuff that I'm often making for brands that they might own to the algorithm. Now, if it's going to be, an online article, it's going to get sucked up anyway on the back end. But in some cases, I'm making, I have a client that is an investment research firm, and I'm making proprietary reports for them. I would love it to write me a headline. I don't like writing headlines.
Yeah.
But that's not worth me giving 40 pages of proprietary stuff that no one else has ever read. Like, I can't feed that to the algorithm. And the truth is, I don't love making headlines. But if I do it, it will take me 5 minutes, 10 max. Like, it doesn't feel like it's radically changing anything in my life. And yet I don't feel right about giving that information. I think where it could be interesting and where I was sort of impressed is in editing. But even there, I have concerns. So I have a different client where similarly, I was doing interviews and they're not recorded. So I was taking notes, and I have really, I'll use abbreviations, but maybe there's typos. I can type pretty fast, almost the speed of speech, but it has to be cleaned up afterwards. And so I was using ChatGPT and telling it to clean it up. And on one hand, I was very impressed by ChatGPT's understanding of my abbreviations. Very, very impressed. And they did a pretty good job, but it was also really changing stuff. And I had to keep prompting it again and again. I was like, keep the structure, keep the meaning, only clean up typos. And I had to tell it like 17 times. And maybe that's just the cost of getting it to do this, but it did save me time. It mostly saved me money because frankly, I wasn't going to spend hours cleaning this up regardless. I was going to hire a human copy editor. And ChatGPT actively stole work from someone I know. And I feel bad about it. It was kind of an experiment, but like, it's not like it saved me time. If anything, it reduced time because this person would not have hallucinated things. Mostly it didn't hallucinate that much, but it hallucinated a little. And I had to be really careful to weed that out because I'm not delivering hallucinations, even mild ones are not okay. And so, whereas like the person I know would not have hallucinated, and this required more oversight and frankly, more work from me. So it didn't save me time. It did save me money. It cost this person who's a professional copy editor money. And, it did a pretty good job. But to me, the big issues I'm concerned about are, and I'll say even in that case, I felt okay using ChatGPT because I was doing research on a company that's deeply in the AI space, and the people I was researching are AI evangelists. And I was like, you know what? I don't think they will be furious at me if I use AI to help clean up this report. But my big issues are, one, training these algorithms, which admittedly would probably be solved with a paid subscription to one of these, the Salesforces of the world that are trying to create proprietary AIs that keep it in a closed ecosystem. I mean, I think some of the more compliance-minded solutions could probably help with that, but as a small business owner, it doesn't feel like the incremental value is worth it for me to pay for that. My concern is heavily in hallucination. And so when I do recorded interviews, I'm typically using a transcription agency that I suspect that they use AI for the first pass, but they but they also have humans. So when they don't hear something, they mark it as inaudible, or when they're not sure, they put it in bold and give you a timestamp. At the moment, AI doesn't do that. AI takes a guess. More perniciously, AI takes a really good guess. And I wish their guess were bad, because then I know that they're making things up. But if they take a good guess of what could be there, but they're wrong, that's very dangerous, especially if you're getting into a regulated industry like finance and investors are making decisions based on this. Like, that feels deeply dangerous and problematic, more than just a nuisance. And that gives me pause. And I only used it on this assignment because I went over every single sentence and searched it for accuracy, which is, I think, what you have to do. But then how much time did it save me?
Right. These are all very, there's the existential questions. I actually grappled with that with another writer earlier, like around end of 2022, early 2023. That's called the Writing in the Age of AI, I think it's called. That's a good one. But then there's the workflow. So I'm curious, you use it for editing. Have you used it in outlining at all, or generating kind of like content ideas?
I've used it a little in idea generation, not in outlining, because I know how to outline. Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't feel like a problem. Like, you asked me
for you, for a content writer,
like,
or content marketer,
yeah,
it's like,
it doesn't feel additive to me, same way that like headline writing, I would like to give it headline writing, but it's saving me 5 or 10 minutes. It's not saving me hours of work here. I feel the same way about outlining, except it's saving me even less than 5 minutes. You know what I mean? I feel like I have an intuitive sense of story flow, as do my writers, who are experienced. I have used it a little bit for idea generation. None of the ideas are that creative, because the point is that it's pulling from everything that exists. It's not really creating full stop. So, I was trying to think of yet more angles on term life insurance for a company that's written hundreds of articles about life insurance. What are some more angles? And most of the ideas it gave me, I did. And I was like, check out the website. Give me some ideas we didn't do. No, most of the ideas it was wrong. We did, or like the headline looked different, but essentially it's the same idea. There were 2 or 3 that were fun, so we did them. They were mostly kind of silly, but every so often it's nice to have a silly one. So I think we wrote something about like depictions of life insurance in Hollywood that are wrong, right? Like, it's, okay, sure. But it didn't rock my world. I mean, it seemed good.
So I think for someone who's naturally creative and a fast thinker with these things, like, it doesn't have as much, not that it doesn't have as much value, but that aspect of it might not be as compelling Whereas like people around the world now who can't think of anything, now this is amazing, right? Now, on the other hand, those people may have a hard time prompting it correctly. Whereas like someone who's been experienced literally prompting real writers, human writers, has an easier time with the prompting. And sometimes it will sort of, just like someone who hires somebody who's not quite like a junior employee says, you know what, get out of the way, let me do it, right?
Right. That's
And
exactly how I feel. Like people keep talking about prompt engineering. They're like, so just spend 10 minutes coaching it and giving it some confidence. And it's just like, why am I doing this? Like I can write the thing in 10 minutes. Like what are we doing here? Like
right.
I don't know. But maybe you could tell me, maybe you'll help me revolutionize my business. I'm struggling at the moment in the current state of it to find major value. And as much as people like to say, oh, like, humans do indeed have this sort of sparkle factor. I think that's true, but I feel like the writers, when they can say emulate so-and-so's style, that's not me. It doesn't know me. It won't emulate my style. And yet it has ingested the hundreds of articles that I've written at Fabric and elsewhere, which means that people say, oh, but the machine isn't like you. Yeah, well, I trained the machine. So
Right.
I hate to say it, but if you give it a really generic prompt, like what is term life insurance, it's going to sound a fair bit like me.
Mm,
I trained it.
yeah. Yeah, it learns you, and that's one thing that that's one advantage. People say the more you use it, like the more it starts to
No,
learn
but
your
I'm not saying that.
style.
I'm saying like on the internet, like if you say, write me a warm,
Yeah.
approachable article about the difference between term and whole life insurance, your answer is based on my work.
Right, right. And that's another
So,
issue. People feel like it steals from them. And I totally get that. My only counter to that be, yes, it sucks, but like everything else, unfortunately, even if we say we're not gonna give our creativity to this algorithm, this machine, so many other people will, that it's sort of like what do you call that? Not bandwagon, free rider. I don't know what it's called, but like when basically everyone's doing it, so that like even if a few people don't,
sure.
unfortunately it will still take the creativity from the world. And I think there's a lot of use cases. So like you, I wasn't super enamored with certain
Yeah.
aspects. There's a lot of things I wanted to do myself, but I think that what it could be good at, like the end of the blank page, as people say, getting that outline, sometimes not writing the final product, but idea generation, creating memos or strategy documents, getting the bare, I'd say the generic stuff, and then you layering on top of it has been really cool. Using it for clipping out video highlights and generating captions and things like that. Like we're no longer having to do that myself, or no longer having to be listening to a video and taking out the highlight. Like all that's gone. Getting the editing, as you said, it definitely helps make things faster. Sometimes getting ideas for visuals,
Mhm.
and then the
I will say,
designer.
I think the visual component, I'm less experienced with that because it's less my bread and butter, but my impression from what I've seen from others is that the visual implications of AI to me seem more impressive. And again, maybe that's because I'm not a graphic designer, and maybe to a graphic designer, the writing components feel more impressive. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think there's a science of, which I'm not super up on, but I know that there's a lot with prompting. But I think for me, it's not so much to generate the actual finished product of the creative content, but to get ideas down on paper and organize a lot of different ideas into like and breaking it down, which might be for a plan, a strategy plan, or some other way. I think it helps organize things very well. That's what I think it really does. And then actually generating the end product content that speaks to the unique audience, and satisfies the client's unique tastes or voice. That's where I think, at least at this point in time, a human operating it can make a huge difference. And just to before we close out, just a fun, just a I love when I make when I'm talking to my guests, I always like to note interesting just things from what they've said and just try to pull it together. You've mentioned a few times you had a background in finance, you love finance, as well as environment. I don't know if you do any content around that. But what I wanted to just highlight is a lot of people might think those are such opposite things. You know, like a lot of people think finance, Wall Street, big business, so different and sometimes
Sure.
opposed to environment. I'd love to, how do you put that all together? Because I think that's
Great. I
fascinating.
love that question. So both, I would say, if you ask second grade me, who would have told you I wanted to be a writer, I grew up in Miami, and that same second grader was really stressing out about her state being underwater with
I'm
rising
in
sea.
Miami today, by the way.
Yeah, well, imagine me there as a child, kind of a little bit hysterical about what we then called global warming.
Yeah.
And so it's been something that I've cared about my entire life. And what has been, I mean, I've done some coverage of, the climate and sustainability space just on its own, like sustainable fashion or, talking about sustainable agriculture. But the part that obviously brings the two together the most is talking about like climate finance. So actually just recently and still, and I haven't, it's not fully finalized yet. I've been working on helping the UN Global Compact edit like a climate finance report that they're doing. They do an annual report. And it's talking about, the progress towards the sustainability goals set out by the UN, but thinking about it in a business context. In some cases, I'm of the belief, as I think are many, that these so-called sustainability goals are really in a company's business interest. If you have a factory in Puerto Rico and you're like, I don't want to waste money on caring about climate, and then you don't, have any sort of adaptation procedures in place, and then the hurricane comes and your factory is totally ruined, right? Like it is often actually genuinely good business to pay attention to not just sustainability, which has this sort of like greenwashy mushiness to it, but thinking about climate change and what its material impacts are on your business. And similarly, thinking about climate finance, that can take many forms. That could mean investing in such a way that you're avoiding fossil fuels. It could also mean something more proactive, such as funding solar projects but they pay a real return, or funding, community development projects. So that is a passion area of mine. And if any of your listeners are listening and you want to work together on something related to climate finance, please do think of me. But yeah, I would say that is my most favorite merging of the two worlds. And one that, in my own view, for obviously I consider it unfortunate, has become so politicized, and ESG has become this kind of dirty word, but it doesn't necessarily mean foregoing profits in order to treat your investments as if it's charity. In some cases, fossil fuels are making a lot of money, and the investors who are missing out on it are comparatively underperforming. But in other cases, they're outperforming. In other, like, studies have shown, this is different from environmental sustainability, but studies have shown that companies that have more gender diverse boards literally outperform. I mean, there's actual material gain to be had. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
for climate
I
finance.
definitely
Let's
think,
talk about it. But
yeah,
yeah,
yes, I thank you. And I think that's the way to go and showcase so let's face it, people don't make changes until they see it's in their interest, especially businesses. They have their
right.
profit generation entities. I think the more you focus on the business results, the business benefits, the more people will change. But unfortunately, climate, just like culture and other things like that, are so they're longer term. They're not like making that immediate sale, just like we were talking about branding. Like people want to
Right.
focus on the short-term gain, not the long term. But if you can show how it's in your interest, the long term will ultimately benefit you much more. I think people will make changes accordingly. So just for my listeners or watchers, where can they find you? And do you have any interesting projects or any offers coming down the pipeline?
Sure. So you can go to my website, is allisonkade.com. Maybe I can spell it, or maybe you'll put it in the
I'll
line.
link it all up in the show notes.
Perfect. So you can go to allisonkade.com, learn a little more about me. We can chat. In addition to all of this, we haven't really said, but I am a money coach as well. So if you want to work on a content project, no, there's no clear offer because every project is different, but let's chat. And where maybe we can do more of an offer is that I do work one-on-one with clients on money coaching, helping them achieve their financial goals, just even thinking about how to prioritize and what they want to work on next, some elements of financial literacy and education. So on that end, we can definitely discuss packages. And I'm doing this on the fly. I might regret it, but let's say to any of your listeners, I'll give a 10% discount off my package.
Awesome. Just mention Z marketing, and
Yeah.
you'll and curious for the financial planning aspect. Are you helping people more who are like struggling or getting out under debt, or is it more people who are like, hey, I have money in savings, but I'd like to make my money work for me, invest? Like, which audience more are you serving?
I'd say probably more the latter, but I've done a bit of both. My bread and butter is, I would say, people who are employed, making at least some sort of a decent income, but might have a lot of responsibilities and priorities, i.e., yeah, I'm making income, but I know I'm supposed to save for retirement, but how do I balance that with saving for college for my kids? But also, I kind of want to send my kids to private school. Ooh, what do we do about that? But also, do I have enough of an emergency fund? But also, what about my aging parents? And just trying to tease some of this apart and figuring out, where should we direct you to next? What are our priorities? How are we working on this and optimizing it? That said, I guess also a pitch for the holiday season. I recently had someone who's probably roughly my own mother's age hire me to work with her 4 adult children. And so in that case, some of her children are in that bucket of doing pretty well, just tweaking and optimizing. Some of her children are in a little bit more of a crisis mode. And so in that case, it's sort of working through, what are these ramifications? Like, how are we going to get this stabilized? And that's probably a client who wouldn't have even had the assets to hire me on her own, not, and might not have sought it out, but I do feel like we're doing some really meaningful work there. So people can always
Awesome.
give some sessions as a gift to someone else if you think someone in your life would benefit for it.
Awesome. All right. So if anyone is working on a content marketing, branding push, or wants to manage their personal finances, definitely reach out to Allison.
It's the most, I feel like it's 2 different offerings, but they're related.
They're related. No, and you explained very well in this episode how like all these different elements and interests in your life come together. And I really thank you for sharing all of this with my listeners, and hope to have you on sometime soon.
Wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.